Buckingham Palace and to marry into the royal family. A journey of self-discovery. Sarah, the Duchess of York, my story.
The announcement that stunned Britain came just after 7:00 on a cold February morning. The kind of morning when London feels suspended under a grey sky that refuses to brighten. Most of the country was still reaching for its first cup of tea when the palace released a statement so abrupt, so heavy that even seasoned reporters paused mid-sentence. The message was only 2 lines long, but those 2 lines carried the weight of an entire winter's unspoken tension. The royal household confirms a significant and tragic development regarding Sarah, Duchess of York, arising unexpectedly after recent external pressures. No elaboration, no explanation, no softening. It was the most jarring palace communication issued since the early days of Charles's reign, and within minutes, the silence of dawn transformed into a nationwide hum of disbelief. Phones buzzed, radio hosts stumbled, news anchors looked into cameras with eyes betraying genuine shock. Viewers across Britain asked the same question: what happened to Sarah Ferguson? And what did Meghan's recent move have to do with it? Outside Buckingham Palace, a handful of early photographers waited beneath the iron gates, their breath turning to pale mist, unsure of what to expect. Statements like this never appeared without reason, deliberation, or consequence. This was no routine clarification. It was a stark announcement suggesting that something had gone terribly wrong behind the scenes. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was unlike anything officials had experienced in recent months. Senior aides moved quickly through corridors, their footsteps sharp against marble floors. Conversations happened in hushed tones. Documents passed with unusual urgency. The tension was quiet but suffocating, the kind that arises when something deeply personal collides with something unavoidably public. In a private sitting room near the Eastern Wing, Charles sat with the printed statement, reading it for what must have been the 20th time. He had approved the wording just before dawn after a night spent grappling with its emotional and political implications. He was not easily shaken, but today his shoulders bore a visible heaviness. He had known Sarah for decades, seen her laugh her way through storms that would have crushed others. Yet the events of the past few days had pierced the palace walls in ways no one anticipated. William joined him shortly after the announcement went live. He paused at the window, watching the courtyard slowly fill with reporters. Normally composed even under strain, his expression held a flicker of worry only those closest to him would recognize. Timing was everything, and Meghan's recent move, whatever her intentions, had triggered reactions the palace could not ignore. "We could not leave this to speculation," William said quietly. Charles nodded, eyes fixed on the statement. "No," he answered, "we could not." Yet beneath his words lingered a truth neither man voiced. Sarah had been struggling long before Meghan's move accelerated matters. It was the convergence of circumstances, the rapid shift in public narrative, renewed global media pressure, and the emotional weight she had carried for months that had pushed everything into crisis. By mid-morning, the reaction from major broadcasters intensified. BBC News analysts dissected the phrasing, noting its unusual directness. Sky correspondents highlighted the rare use of the word tragic. Across the Atlantic, American morning shows ran the announcement with breaking banners, speculating endlessly about the origins of the crisis. Outside, noise and speculation contrasted sharply with the quiet grief inside the palace. Anne arrived just after 9:00, posture straight, expression firm. She had long respected Sarah's resilience and said without ceremony, "This will be difficult for her daughters," referring to Beatrice and Eugenie, who had been privately notified and had reacted with shock, anger, and heavy sadness. Camilla joined soon after, her face reflecting deep empathy. Once vilified herself, she understood the fragile line between public life and private collapse. "She has been under too much strain," she said gently, and no one disagreed. As noon approached, the palace inbox filled with messages from officials, charities, and global partners seeking clarification. But the palace remained silent. Behind closed doors, senior figures agreed the public deserved an explanation, but timing had to honor Sarah's well-being first. What mattered now was not optics, politics, or perception. It was Sarah, and the truth behind the morning's tragic announcement was far more painful and complicated than the world yet understood. To understand how the palace reached such a breaking point, we must step back into the quiet, uneasy weeks preceding it. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible, noticeable only to those accustomed to the rhythms of royal life. In early February, Sarah's schedule appeared lighter than usual. Staff initially assumed a temporary adjustment following a busy winter. But as days passed, those closest to her recognized the change as emotional, not logistical. Sarah, normally someone who could brighten a room, moved through engagements with a softer voice and slower steps. Her laughter, once warm and quick, grew quieter. Smiles became habitual rather than joyful. Royal aides exchanged glances, sensing she carried a weight she could not yet voice. Even her daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, attuned to her emotional landscape, felt the growing tension. Conversations became shorter, and gentler, as if Sarah were conserving energy she no longer possessed. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior staff observed with increasing concern. They had seen similar patterns when Sarah had been caught between public expectation and private exhaustion, but this time it felt different, seeping into places she could not keep sealed. In mid-February, Charles received a quiet briefing from a senior advisor who had worked with Sarah for over 20 years. The advisor hesitated, choosing words carefully. "She is more fragile than she appears." Charles nodded, tightening his face with concern. He understood the slow pull of public life, the tide moving someone farther from shore without their realization. Sarah, generous to a fault, had always given more than she kept for herself. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Meghan, across the Atlantic, was preparing a move of her own. A fictional repositioning later interpreted as bold, unexpected, and ill-timed for the royal household. It was not malicious, nor aimed at Sarah personally, but its ripple effect through the media proved destabilizing. In late February, international outlets received coordinated hints of Meghan's forthcoming humanitarian platform. Coverage framed her move as reclaiming public space, a re-entry into global narrative. The dramatic story consumed headlines without regard for timing, contrasting sharply with Sarah's retreat from the spotlight and amplifying public perception of tension within the family. By late February, senior aides noticed a second shift in Sarah. She grew quieter, read fewer briefings, and avoided news segments discussing the monarchy's internal dynamics. She was not jealous or defensive, simply exhausted in ways she had not been for years. The emotional landscape tightened around her as Meghan's emerging move drew renewed media attention, and Sarah, already worn down, absorbed the pressure with no shield left. By early March, it was no longer a question of whether Sarah was struggling, but how long she could carry the weight before finally giving way. The moment that would upend Sarah Ferguson's emotional footing began quietly on a Thursday morning near the end of February, just past 8:00 in Montecito, when Meghan approved the final details of her new fictional public initiative, a sweeping humanitarian platform designed to amplify her global voice. It was confident, polished, and framed with the unmistakable tone of return, a reassertion of presence that had been building for months. There was nothing inherently malicious in the decision. No one intended harm within the royal circle, but the timing, the scale, and the media's immediate reaction created a wave that surged straight toward London long before anyone had time to brace for it. Within hours, major American networks ran segments previewing Meghan's move. Commentators spoke excitedly of reinvention, rebirth, an opportunity to reclaim a narrative she once shared with the monarchy. The language was sweeping, almost theatrical. Words like comeback, resurgence, and global repositioning filled broadcasts. By sunset over California, the story had already crossed the Atlantic. When British tabloids caught wind, the fuse shortened dramatically. By early the next morning, London newspapers printed headlines suggesting Meghan's move challenged royal stability. Some outlets framed it as an attempt to overshadow the monarchy's efforts. Others suggested it put pressure on public perception of Catherine, William, and the household. The most damaging narrative, though entirely fictional, centered on comparisons between Meghan and Sarah. It began with a single column in a mid-tier British paper, describing Meghan's announcement as the dawn of a new era, while portraying Sarah's quiet retreat as the fadding of an older chapter. It was an unfair contrast, born from media instinct rather than truth. Within hours, social platforms transformed it into a story neither woman had invited. The public dissected their lives, choices, and emotional resilience, debates growing louder, harsher, and more intrusive with each passing day. Inside Buckingham Palace, the communications team scrambled. They had hoped the noise would settle naturally, but instead it swelled, reshaping the digital landscape faster than the institution could respond. Senior royal aides gathered in an emergency briefing. Charts, timelines, and trending analytics filled the table, each concluding the same thing. Meghan's move had become a lightning rod, and the collateral damage was falling squarely on Sarah. One advisor spoke quietly, almost apologetically. "People are twisting the story into competition. It is not fair to either woman." Another added that the emotional temperature online had climbed so sharply that even neutral observers interpreted Sarah's quiet presence as symbolic decline. The palace knew this was inaccurate, but public narratives rarely bend to reason once momentum builds. When William received the report, his expression tightened. He remembered how quickly public perception could turn a harmless gesture into a headline that cut deep. "We cannot let her be dragged into this," he said, referring to Sarah. His voice was firm, but beneath it lay a heavier recognition of how vulnerable she had become after weeks of emotional strain. Catherine read the same report that evening and felt a knot form behind her ribs. She had always admired Sarah's resilience, her ability to step into the spotlight with warmth even after years of struggle. Seeing her caught in a crosscurrent she never invited stirred something quietly fierce in Catherine, but the person most affected was Sarah herself. As Meghan's initiative dominated headlines, Sarah found herself drawn unwillingly into the narrative. Old photographs resurfaced. Past interviews were re-examined. Commentators dissected her public life, not out of cruelty, but in misguided attempts to contrast her with Meghan's momentum. Sarah saw the stories, read the analyses, felt the comparisons. Each one added another layer to exhaustion that had already taken root deep within her. On a particularly cold afternoon, Beatrice visited her mother at Royal Lodge. She found Sarah sitting near a window, hands clasped, eyes distant in a way that made Beatrice feel unsteady. "Mom," she said gently, "none of this is your fault." Sarah nodded, voice barely above a whisper. I know that logically, but I cannot stop feeling swept aside." That was when Beatrice understood the severity of the situation. It was not Meghan's move that caused the crisis. It was the storm of reaction, the comparisons, the speculation, and the emotional pressure that had stretched Sarah beyond her limits. By the first days of March, the palace had no choice but to act. This was no longer about media noise. It was about a woman they cared for deeply, someone who needed protection, clarity, and space from a narrative spiraling beyond control. The crisis was undeniable, and it would only grow louder. The emergency meeting was called just after dawn on a windswept March morning. Cold and colourless, the day felt almost like an omen. Buckingham Palace had held countless closed-door discussions, strategic, ceremonial, personal, but few carried the gravity filling the air that morning. Corridors felt narrower, silence heavier, as if the walls themselves sensed the crisis tightening around Sarah Ferguson and the urgency of decisions that had to be made. Charles arrived first, escorted by 2 senior aides carrying briefing folders marked in discreet crimson ink. He waved them out quickly. He wanted no audience, only family, only truth. He sat at the polished table's end, rubbing his hands slowly, a gesture inherited from his father, displayed only when situations pierced him personally. William entered next, still in his winter coat, face pale from the cold and the long night spent reviewing reports. He placed a thick stack of documents before him and exhaled slowly. "It has worsened," he said quietly. "The narrative is growing faster than we can contain it." Charles nodded, a small, somber movement. "I expected as much." Anne stepped in briskly, posture firm, expression carrying the clarity she brought to crises for decades. Removing her gloves and placing them neatly beside her, she said without sitting, "We should have intervened earlier. She has been unraveling for weeks." The words hung in the air unchallenged. Moments later, Camilla entered, soft-footed but resolute, eyes reflecting deeper understanding of what it meant to be caught in narratives one cannot control. She moved to Charles's side, laying a hand gently on his chair's back, grounding him with a touch that spoke volumes. When the private secretary closed the doors, the meeting began. William spoke first, summarizing the digital analysis, media escalation, harmful comparisons, and the emotional strain saturating the conversation. "What began as an announcement from Meghan has become something else," he said. "A storm built from reaction, not intention, and Sarah is at the center of it." Anne leaned forward, hands clasped. "The danger now is not public relations. It is her well-being." Camilla nodded. "She has always carried more than the public sees, and she's exhausted. Anyone can see it." Charles exhaled long and heavy. "She has stood by this family through storms that would have overwhelmed others," he said softly. "I owe her more than silence." William's voice shifted, steady and resolute. "Then we need to act decisively, not tomorrow, now." The private secretary outlined 3 possible responses, all respectful, all protective. But Anne spoke again, her tone edged with unmistakable directness. "There is only one answer," she said. "We acknowledge what is happening. We confirm she is stepping back, and we shield her from further comparison." Charles closed his eyes for a moment. The decision was painful, far more emotional than political, but undeniable. Sarah needed space, she needed protection, she needed the palace to speak before speculation consumed her completely. Camilla stepped into the silence. "Compassion is not a weakness," she said gently. "It is a responsibility." With that, the decision was sealed. The wording would be careful, the tone solemn, the message clear. Sarah Ferguson would step away for her well-being, and the palace would stand firmly behind her. As the meeting ended, no one felt victory. Only gravity, sorrow, and the unspoken hope that this heavy, heartbreaking but essential decision might finally give Sarah the relief she had been denied for far too long. When the palace announcement broke across Britain, it arrived not like a thunderclap, but like a slow, trembling shock wave rippling through households, news broadcasts, and social feeds. The statement, restrained yet devastating, spread faster than officials could track, igniting a chorus of responses that revealed just how deeply Sarah Ferguson's presence remained woven into the nation's emotional memory. In London, commuters froze mid-stride as the bulletin flashed across outdoor screens. A woman in her late 60s pressed a hand to her chest, whispering, "Not Sarah, not again." A bus driver pulled over, turning up the radio as presenters read the confirmation with voices thickened under the weight of the words. In Edinburgh, 2 university students stared at their phones in disbelief, noting that the monarchy had not issued a statement this stark in years. Before noon, every major British network shifted into rolling coverage. On the BBC, commentators spoke with a somber tone usually reserved for national tragedies. They revisited Sarah's long public journey, the exuberant Duchess of the late 1980s, the storm-weathering figure of the 1990s, the redeemed and determined woman who had rebuilt herself again and again in the public eye. Now hearing she had stepped back indefinitely for her well-being, viewers felt protective, even heartbroken. "She has survived too much," one analyst said quietly. And perhaps the toll has finally caught up with her. Sky News framed the development within the context of the recent narrative storm triggered by Meghan's fictional public move. Their analysts did not blame Meghan. The palace never implied that, but they recognised how the media frenzy around her resurgence had intensified scrutiny on every royal figure, pressing especially hard on the one with the fewest defences left. It was the collision, not the intention, that caused the injury. Across the Atlantic, American networks reacted swiftly. Early morning shows in New York spoke with a mix of sympathy and analytical curiosity, noting the gravity of the palace's wording and how rare it was for the institution to acknowledge personal strains so openly. Some questioned the role of international media in fueling comparisons that contributed to Sarah's exhaustion. Others expressed sadness for a woman who had made herself approachable to the public for decades, even when it cost her deeply. Yet the most powerful reactions came from ordinary people. Online, thousands shared memories of meetings with Sarah, brief encounters at charity events, kind gestures, handwritten notes, moments where she offered warmth without cameras to capture it. "She made me feel seen," one man wrote. "I hope someone is making her feel seen now." Another shared a photo from 1997, recalling how Sarah comforted her at a hospital visit. "She told me I was brave. Now I want to tell her the same," the post read. But it was Beatrice and Eugenie who bore the heaviest emotional weight. Photographed arriving separately at a private Windsor residence that morning, their expressions revealed far more than the palace would admit publicly. In quiet conversation, they grieved the pressure their mother had endured, silently grateful the palace had intervened, fearful of what might come next. Former royal staff appeared on news programs throughout the day, speaking cautiously but compassionately. One former aide described Sarah as a woman who gave even when she had nothing left to give. Another remarked, "She has always risen, but even the strongest need somewhere to land." By late afternoon, initial shock began to settle into collective reflection. Commentators shifted from speculation to empathy. The public tone softened. Newspapers moved from sensational angles to measured concern. Even critics acknowledged the decision had been made out of care, not strategy. The truth had spread, and the world, seeing Sarah not as a figure of intrigue, but as a woman carrying years of invisible weight, responded with a rare, unified sentiment. She deserved rest and peace. As dusk settled over London, the palace found itself at a quiet but unmistakable turning point. The monarchy had weathered scandals and tragedies before, but this moment felt profoundly human. At the centre was Sarah Ferguson, a woman who had spent nearly 4 decades navigating public affection and scrutiny with remarkable tenacity, and who now needed what the royal family had rarely offered: protection without expectation. Inside Clarence's house, Charles remained in his study long after the final update had been delivered. Reports lay scattered across his desk, but his gaze drifted to the window, where city lights flickered faintly against evening fog. He thought of Sarah not as a public figure, but as the bright, fiery soul he had known since the 1980s. Someone who endured triumph and humiliation without letting her spirit fully dim. For the first time in years, he wondered whether the monarchy had asked too much of her, whether relentless attention had slowly worn her down, and whether this moment of stepping back was not retreat but necessary mercy. Across Windsor, William processed the announcement with quiet intensity. He stood in Adelaide Cottage, reviewing the final briefing. As future king, he understood the demands of duty better than most, but as a son and a father watching public life's toll on his family, he recognized the importance of firm, compassionate boundaries. What happened to Sarah was not her fault. It was the unforgiving nature of public momentum, and William felt urgent responsibility to ensure she never again became collateral damage in a narrative she never asked to be part of. Anne moved through palace halls with her usual resolute stride, thoughts lingering on Sarah's decades of resilience. Anne respected strength in all its forms, and Sarah's had always been unconventional, messy, emotional, sometimes impulsive, yet undeniably real. Watching her step back stirred something protective even in Anne. "She has carried enough," she murmured to a confidant. "This is the right decision." Camilla spent the evening in her private sitting room, surrounded by quiet and books. Having endured long seasons of public cruelty herself, she felt deep empathy for Sarah. Emotional wounds left by scrutiny did not fade easily. They lingered, resurfacing when least expected. Camilla knew what it meant to rebuild oneself in the shadows of misunderstanding, and she truly hoped Sarah would now have time and space to heal without noise, comparison, or expectation. As the palace adjusted internal plans, senior aides acknowledged the moment required careful restructuring. Scheduled engagements would shift, patronages reassigned, communication strategies rewritten to emphasize respect, care, and the necessity of Sarah's retreat. There was no resentment, no frustration, only collective resolve to honor her privacy. But the emotional heart of the day lay not within the palace, but in Sarah's quiet home. Away from cameras, comparisons, and the noise that had shaped her story for far too long, Beatrice and Eugenie remained close, offering presence rather than reassurance, the kind that steadies rather than solves. Those near them said the sisters felt something they had not felt in years. Relief. Relief that their mother was no longer expected to be strong simply because she always had been. By nightfall, a strange peace settled over the royal landscape. Not finality, not closure, but a pause long overdue. Sarah Ferguson, the woman who had risen from every fall with unyielding grace, had finally been given permission to rest, and the palace, in a rare act of unity and compassion, chose to build its next chapter around that truth. In moments like these, even the brightest lives carry shadows unseen.